Picture this. It's 1945, the final days of Nazi Germany. In the smoking ruins of Berlin, something impossible is happening. A 17-year-old boy from France clutches a German rifle, dying for a cause that considers his people inferior. 3 blocks away, a Swedish teenager fires at advancing Soviet tanks. Around the corner, Dutch soldiers bleed alongside Croatian volunteers. Spanish fighters die next to Ukrainian conscripts. 15 different nationalities, 15 different countries. All of them willing to die for Adolf Hitler, a man who literally viewed most of them as racially beneath Germans. This isn't fiction. This actually happened. These weren't German soldiers defending their homeland. These were foreign volunteers who had traveled hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles to join what would become one of history's most controversial military organizations, the Waffen-SS. You've heard the name. You know the reputation. But here's what's going to shock you. By the war's end, nearly 1 in 4 SS soldiers wasn't even German. How did this happen? How did an organization that began as Hitler's personal bodyguard become an international army of nearly 1 million men? And more disturbing still, how did ordinary young men from across Europe willingly transform themselves into instruments of one of history's darkest chapters? Tonight, we're going to uncover the complete story of the Waffen-SS. Not the propaganda version, not the Hollywood version, the real story of how a small group of German bodyguards evolved into a multinational fighting force that would leave an indelible mark on military history. This is a story about manipulation, desperation, and the terrifying ease with which ordinary people can be turned into something else entirely. But before we can understand how the Waffen-SS recruited from across Europe, we need to go back to the beginning, back to where it all started, back to a failed chicken farmer with thick glasses and grand delusions who would create one of the most feared organizations in human history. The year is 1922. Heinrich Himmler stands in a muddy field outside Munich, watching his chickens die, again. The 22-year-old son of a Bavarian schoolmaster has invested everything into this farming venture. His father's money, his own future, his desperate hope for success, and it's all falling apart. The chickens keep getting sick. The neighbors whisper that he's incompetent. His bank account hemorrhages money faster than he can count it. Heinrich Himmler, future architect of genocide, is a complete failure at raising poultry. But this unremarkable man harbored remarkable fantasies. While other young men his age chased women or learned practical trades, Heinrich devoured books about ancient warriors, Roman legions, Germanic tribes, medieval knights. He spent countless hours sketching elaborate battle plans, imagining himself as some great military commander, leading armies to glorious victory. There was just one problem with these fantasies. Heinrich was terrible at everything he tried. The German army had rejected him during World War I. Too young, they claimed, though his medical file told a different story. Weak constitution, poor eyesight, nervous disposition. While other men his age died heroically in the trenches of France, Heinrich remained at home, consumed by dreams of glory that seemed forever beyond his reach. The rejection ate at him like acid, festering into a resentment that would eventually poison millions of lives. So there he stood in that muddy field, a failed farmer with delusions of grandeur, when fate intervened. He heard about a new political movement gaining momentum in Munich's beer halls, a radical party led by an Austrian corporal named Adolf Hitler, who promised to restore Germany's greatness and avenge the humiliations of defeat. Heinrich saw his chance. He joined the Nazi Party as member number 1423, not exactly a founding father, but early enough to matter when the movement eventually succeeded. He threw himself into party work with the desperate enthusiasm of a man who had finally found his purpose. He organized rallies, maintained membership lists, handled the boring administrative tasks that more charismatic leaders avoided. Slowly, methodically, Heinrich made himself indispensable, and Adolf Hitler began to notice him. The moment that would change history came on January 6, 1929. Hitler summoned Heinrich to his office for what the chicken farmer would later describe as the most important meeting of his life. The Führer had a problem. He needed someone to run his personal protection unit, the Schutzstaffel, better known as the SS. It was tiny then, maybe 300 men scattered across Germany. Most of the Nazi leadership considered it insignificant, too small to matter in the grand scheme of things. But Heinrich Himmler was desperate for any opportunity to prove himself. When Hitler looked across his desk at this nervous, stammering former farmer and spoke 5 words that would echo through history, everything changed. Heinrich, the SS is yours. In that moment, something fundamental shifted in Heinrich Himmler's mind. For the first time in his pathetic life, someone important was trusting him with real power. Not much power, granted. The SS was basically a glorified security detail, about as significant as nightclub bouncers. But to Heinrich, it represented everything he had ever dreamed of achieving. He walked out of that meeting with a secret thought burning in his consciousness. He would show them all what he was capable of. He would build something magnificent from this tiny organization. He would create his own empire. And Heinrich had found his true calling. Not farming, not business, empire building. He started small, but thought big. Heinrich began recruiting men who embodied his personal fantasy of ancient Germanic warriors. Tall, blonde, physically imposing specimens. Everything Heinrich himself was not. He created elaborate rituals borrowed from medieval traditions. He designed dramatic uniforms that commanded respect and inspired fear. He wrote mystical oaths about honor and loyalty and racial destiny. Heinrich was building his own personal army, and he was surprisingly good at it. By 1930, just 1 year after taking command, Heinrich had grown the SS from 300 men to over 52,000. Still smaller than the SA, the brown-shirted stormtroopers who served as the party's muscle, but growing at an exponential rate. And Heinrich had plans that extended far beyond anyone's imagination. He started talking about the SS as something more than bodyguards. They would be a new elite, the future leadership of Germany, the latest incarnation of elite guards that had protected great leaders throughout history. He told recruits they were joining an ancient and noble brotherhood that stretched back to the Praetorian Guard of Rome, the bodyguards of Caesar, Napoleon's old guard. There has always been a guard, he would tell them during recruitment speeches, and the guard of the new Germany will be the SS. It was brilliant manipulation. Heinrich was taking ordinary German men, farmers and factory workers and shop clerks, and convincing them they were destined for greatness. He was selling them the same fantasy he had sold himself, that they were special, that they were chosen, that they were superior to everyone around them. And they believed him because they desperately wanted to believe him. But Heinrich faced a serious problem that threatened to destroy his growing organization before it could achieve its potential. His men kept dying. In the early days of the Nazi movement, political violence was constant and deadly. Street fights with communist militants, brawls with socialist organizers, pitched battles with anyone who opposed the party's rise to power. The SA thrived in this chaos. They were thugs who genuinely enjoyed the violence, men who had found their calling in political street fighting. But Heinrich's SS men were supposed to be different, elite, disciplined, above the common brawling that characterized Nazi politics. This supposed superiority made them prime targets for their enemies. Communist fighters specifically hunted SS men because they represented Nazi leadership and ideology. They would ambush them after rallies, attack them in their homes, sometimes torture them before delivering the killing blow. Heinrich received reports almost daily of his carefully selected warriors being picked off one by one. Another SS man beaten to death in Berlin. Another found shot in Munich. Another disappeared completely in Hamburg, his fate unknown but easily imagined. His elite guard was being systematically destroyed by enemies who understood exactly what the SS represented and were determined to eliminate it before it could grow stronger. That's when Heinrich learned the most important lesson of his entire life, a lesson that would shape everything that followed. If you want to build an empire, you cannot simply recruit followers. You must create fanatics, men so completely devoted to your cause that death becomes irrelevant. Men who believe in something bigger than themselves with religious fervor. Heinrich began refining his recruitment process with scientific precision. He wasn't just looking for strong bodies anymore. He was looking for empty souls. Men desperate for purpose, meaning, belonging. Men like himself who would trade everything, even their basic humanity, for the promise of being special. By 1934, Heinrich had created something unprecedented in modern history. An organization that combined the loyalty of a religious cult with the efficiency of a military unit. His SS had grown so large and powerful that it was beginning to eclipse the SA as the Nazi Party's primary enforcement arm. The stormtroopers were getting nervous about this competition for influence and resources. Their leader, Ernst Röhm, was talking openly about revolution, about a second wave of Nazi transformation that would sweep away the old order completely. This made Adolf Hitler extremely nervous, not because of personal animosity toward Röhm, who had been his friend and supporter for over a decade, but because Röhm represented an independent power base that could potentially challenge Hitler's absolute authority. Heinrich sensed an opportunity, a chance to prove that his SS was more than just an elite bodyguard unit, a chance to demonstrate that they could serve as Hitler's executioners when necessary. The test would come sooner than anyone expected, and it would be written in blood. June 30th, 1934, the night of the long knives. Heinrich Himmler is about to prove his SS can do more than just stand guard. They can commit murder on command. The target wasn't some external enemy. It was Ernst Röhm, leader of the SA and one of Hitler's oldest allies, a decorated war hero who had helped build the Nazi movement from nothing. A man who had literally taken bullets for the cause during the failed beer hall putsch 11 years earlier. But Röhm had made a fatal mistake. He had become too powerful, too independent, too willing to challenge Hitler's vision of how Germany should be transformed. His SA numbered over 400,000 brown-shirted street fighters. That was larger than Germany's official army, and Röhm was making increasingly bold statements about merging his forces with the regular military under his personal command. Hitler saw this as an existential threat to his authority, not from Röhm personally, but from what Röhm represented: an alternative center of power within the Nazi movement, a potential rival who could challenge the Führer's absolute control. So Hitler made a decision that would define his regime forever. He would eliminate potential threats before they could materialize. He would kill his friends before they could betray him. The plan was elegantly simple and absolutely ruthless. SS units would strike simultaneously across Germany, arresting and executing SA leaders, along with various political rivals and personal enemies. They would claim the SA was planning a coup, that they were acting to save the Reich from internal treachery. It was Hitler's first great lie as Führer, but it certainly wouldn't be his last. Heinrich's SS was finally going to prove its worth in blood. On the morning of June 30th, carefully selected SS officers received their orders and target lists. SA leaders, political opponents, even some old personal grudges that Hitler wanted settled permanently. Many of these men were friends and comrades of the SS officers assigned to kill them. Men they had served alongside, drunk with, trusted completely. But orders were orders. and Heinrich had spent 5 years training his men to follow orders without question. The killing began before dawn and continued for 3 days. SS units dragged SA leaders from their homes, from restaurants, from their beds. Some targets fought back desperately. Most didn't, unable to believe that their own comrades were murdering them in cold blood. Many went to their deaths, still convinced it was all some terrible mistake that would be corrected once the confusion cleared. But there was no confusion, only systematic execution. The official death toll would later be listed as 85, though the real number was probably 10 times higher. Once the killing started, it took on a momentum of its own. SS officers settled personal scores, eliminated rivals, and disposed of anyone they considered problematic. The purge expanded far beyond Hitler's original list, as local commanders took initiative to clean house in their own areas. When the smoke cleared, the SA was finished as an independent force. Ernst Röhm himself was dead, shot in his prison cell by Theodor Eicke, who would later command the infamous Totenkopf division. The surviving stormtroopers were either absorbed into other organizations or simply melted back into civilian life. The brown shirts became a historical footnote overnight, but Heinrich's SS emerged as the clear winner. They had proven their absolute loyalty to Hitler by committing mass murder on his personal command. They had demonstrated they were willing to kill anyone, even their own comrades, if the Führer demanded it. In Heinrich's mind, they had graduated from bodyguards to enforcers. On July 13th, Hitler addressed the Reichstag and announced that 61 people had been executed during the emergency. He claimed 13 had died resisting arrest, and 3 had committed suicide. The real numbers were probably 20 times higher, but nobody was in a position to challenge Hitler's version of events. Anyone who might have spoken up was already dead. For Heinrich's organization, the Night of the Long Knives was a turning point that could never be reversed. They had crossed a line that separated them forever from normal military or police units. They had murdered their friends in cold blood and done it in service to Adolf Hitler's paranoid fantasies. There was no moral ground left to stand on, no principles left to uphold, no humanity left to preserve. Heinrich Himmler watched it all with deep satisfaction. His SS had passed the ultimate test of loyalty. They weren't just willing to die for the cause. They were willing to kill for it, to betray their friendships, abandon their morals, and commit murder without hesitation when ordered to do so. They had become exactly what Heinrich needed them to be, the perfect instrument of terror. Now he just had to figure out how to use this instrument to build his empire. But creating killers was only the first step. Heinrich needed to transform these killers into something resembling elite soldiers. He needed to give them training that would make them effective on battlefields as well as in back alleys. He needed to create warriors who could conquer nations, not just murder political opponents. For this crucial task, Heinrich turned to a man who would revolutionize military training and create some of the most feared soldiers in history. Felix Steiner was everything Heinrich Himmler wasn't. Born into Prussian military aristocracy, he was a career officer from the old school who initially looked down on Hitler's movement as crude populism practiced by social inferiors. But the Great War had broken something fundamental inside Felix, and the broken pieces had reassembled themselves in a completely different configuration. As a young lieutenant during the Battle of the Somme in 1916, Felix had watched 60,000 British soldiers become casualties in a single day. He had observed through his field glasses as waves of men walked directly into machine gun fire, falling like grain before a mechanical harvester. The old tactics, the old concepts of honor and warfare, all of it had proven completely useless against modern industrial killing machines. Felix returned from the war convinced that everything had changed forever. Traditional military thinking was not just outdated, it was actively dangerous. Future conflicts would be won by small units of fanatically trained elite troops who could break through enemy lines and create havoc behind them. He had studied the German stormtrooper tactics from 1918 that had nearly won the war, and he had revolutionary ideas about how to improve them. When Heinrich offered Felix command of the SS Deutschland Regiment in 1935, he saw his opportunity. Here was an organization with unlimited resources, ambitious goals, and complete freedom from traditional military bureaucracy. He could finally test his theories about creating the perfect soldier without interference from conservative generals or outdated regulations. The fact that this organization was attached to the Nazi Party barely registered in Felix's thinking. He wasn't interested in politics or ideology. He was interested in warfare as a science and an art form. Felix established his training facility at Dachau, right next to Heinrich's concentration camp. The location wasn't coincidental. Felix wanted his recruits to understand from their very first day that this wasn't the regular army they were joining. This was something darker, more serious, more demanding than anything they had previously experienced. The screams from the camp next door served as constant motivation. Work hard and excel, or you might end up on the other side of that fence. Training began at 6 in the morning with physical conditioning that would have killed professional athletes, 20-mile runs in full combat gear, obstacle courses designed by engineers to be nearly impossible to complete, hand-to-hand combat instruction where broken bones were considered normal occupational hazards. Felix wasn't just building soldiers. He was systematically breaking down human beings and rebuilding them as weapons. But the physical training was merely the foundation. Felix's real innovation was psychological conditioning specifically designed to destroy normal human responses to danger and death. He created exercises that pushed men far beyond the breaking point and then demanded they continue functioning. The grenade drill became legendary among SS veterans. Recruits would stand absolutely motionless while instructors placed live hand grenades directly on top of their helmets. The grenades had 4-second fuses. The recruit's job was to remain perfectly still until the instructor removed the explosive device with exactly 1 second remaining before detonation. Move too early, and you failed the exercise. Move too late, and you died. The margin for error was literally measured in heartbeats. Then there was the tank exercise that eliminated more recruits than combat ever would. Soldiers would lie in shallow foxholes while 30-ton panzers drove directly over their prone bodies. The clearance between tank treads and human flesh was perhaps 6 inches. If you panicked, if you tried to escape, the tank would crush you into the mud. Felix lost at least 3 recruits this way, possibly more. He considered these deaths acceptable casualties in the process of creating superior warriors. Karl Brenner was 19 when he arrived at Dachau in 1937. The son of a Munich shopkeeper, he had joined the SS because his girlfriend thought the black uniform looked impressive on him. Within a week, he was questioning everything he had ever believed about himself and his own capabilities. The first time instructors made Karl lie under an advancing tank, he vomited from sheer terror. The SS sergeant in charge, a man named Mueller, laughed at his weakness and called him a coward in front of the entire training group. Then Mueller forced Karl to clean up his own vomit before attempting the exercise again. And again. And again. This continued until Karl could lie motionless while 30 tons of steel passed inches from his face without showing any external sign of fear or stress. "The first time I thought I was going to die," Karl wrote in his diary. "The 10th time I stopped caring whether I lived or died. The 20th time I realized I was already dead inside." That transformation was exactly what Felix Steiner wanted to achieve. He wasn't teaching recruits to follow orders or display courage under fire. He was teaching them to abandon their humanity completely, to become so disconnected from normal human emotion that killing would feel as natural as breathing. The live ammunition exercises served as the final examination in this curriculum of controlled psychopathy. Recruits would assault mock enemy positions while instructors fired real bullets over their heads. The rounds were supposed to miss by 3 feet. Sometimes they missed by considerably less. Sometimes they didn't miss at all. Heinrich Himmler, a recruit from Hamburg, caught a bullet in the shoulder during his final training exercise. As he lay bleeding in the dirt, his instructor stood over him and asked a simple question. "What do you do when you're wounded in combat, Heinrich?" Delirious with pain and blood loss, Heinrich gasped out the correct answer. "Complete the mission." So they made him crawl the remaining 100 meters to his objective before calling for medical assistance. Heinrich survived, but the bullet had shattered his collarbone permanently. He never regained full use of his left arm. Felix considered this a perfect success story. Heinrich had proven he would follow orders even while dying. That made him an ideal SS officer. But the psychological manipulation extended far beyond physical courage or pain tolerance. Felix had carefully studied the techniques used by religious cults and revolutionary movements throughout history. He understood exactly how to break down individual identity and replace it with group loyalty. Recruits were forbidden to use their given names. They became numbers, ranks, functions within the larger organism. Their personal histories were systematically erased and replaced with SS mythology. They weren't Karl from Munich or Heinrich from Hamburg anymore. They were warriors in an ancient brotherhood that stretched back through Germanic tribes and Roman legions. Felix would lecture them for hours about their racial superiority, their historical destiny, their sacred duty to protect the German people from existential threats. But the real indoctrination didn't happen during these formal presentations. It occurred through shared suffering. When you've survived hell alongside other men, when you've watched comrades die and somehow kept going, you'll believe anything that gives meaning to that sacrifice. By 1939, Felix had refined his process into a precision instrument of human transformation. He could take any reasonably fit German male and within 6 months, turn him into a fanatical killing machine. The failure rate had dropped from 85% to 60%. Still brutal by any reasonable standard, but efficient enough for Heinrich's expanding purposes. The graduates of Felix's program would go on to become the core leadership of what would eventually be called the Waffen-SS. They would command divisions of foreign volunteers, lead desperate last stands in ruined cities, and commit atrocities that would echo through history for generations. But Felix had created something he couldn't control. His graduates weren't just elite soldiers capable of extraordinary courage and tactical skill. They were men who had been systematically stripped of normal human empathy and moral restraint. They could fight with incredible determination, but they could also commit unspeakable acts without hesitation. Because Felix hadn't just taught them to kill enemies, he had taught them to kill their own conscience. And Heinrich Himmler couldn't have been more pleased with the results. This was exactly what he needed for the next phase of his plan. While Felix Steiner was forging killers from German recruits, Heinrich Himmler faced a different challenge entirely. How do you convince children to embrace evil? How do you weaponize an entire generation before they're old enough to understand what's happening to them? The answer came from an unexpected source, a man whose own family history should have made him Hitler's enemy, not his most effective recruiter of youth. Baldur von Schirach was a walking contradiction wrapped in Nazi ideology. Born in Berlin in 1907, his mother was American. His great-grandfather had been a Union officer in the Civil War, fighting to free enslaved people. By every measure of logic and family tradition, Baldur should have opposed everything the Nazi Party represented. Instead, he became Hitler's Minister of Youth, the man responsible for turning 7.7 million German children into instruments of the regime. When Hitler appointed Baldur as Reich Youth Leader in 1933, Germany possessed a rich ecosystem of youth organizations, Boy Scout troops, church groups, sports clubs, political societies, dozens of different organizations that gave children opportunities for adventure, learning, and moral development outside the influence of radical politics. Within 2 years, Balder had systematically destroyed every single one of them. The process was methodical and ruthless. First, Hitler youth groups would infiltrate existing organizations, recruiting members and gradually spreading Nazi ideology from within. Then they would create artificial conflicts, accusing established leadership of disloyalty or corruption. Finally, government authorities would investigate these manufactured accusations and disband the targeted organizations completely. Their members were forcibly transferred to the Hitler Youth. Resistance was met with violence and legal persecution. Hans Weber was 12 when his local Boy Scout troop was absorbed into the Hitler Youth in 1934. He had loved scouting, the camping trips, earning merit badges, the genuine sense of adventure and accomplishment. He naturally assumed the Hitler Youth would offer similar experiences, with perhaps a bit more emphasis on German history and patriotism. He was catastrophically wrong. Where scouting had emphasized outdoor skills and character development, the Hitler Youth focused relentlessly on political indoctrination and military preparation. Instead of learning practical knots and wilderness survival, Hans learned to identify racial characteristics and report suspicious behavior. Instead of community service projects, he attended massive rallies where thousands of children chanted slogans they barely understood. The transformation was gradual, but relentless, designed to be invisible to parents until it was too late to reverse. At first, Hans's mother and father thought their son was simply receiving patriotic education. He was learning German history, staying physically fit, developing leadership qualities. What could be wrong with that? But slowly, almost imperceptibly, they began noticing changes in their child's behavior and attitudes. Hans stopped attending church, claiming religious faith was for weak people. He began correcting his parents when they expressed political opinions that contradicted his Hitler Youth instruction. He started asking pointed questions about his mother's Jewish friend from work. By 1937, Hans had become a stranger in his own home. His parents felt like they were losing their child to something they couldn't understand or fight against. It was like watching our son be recruited into a cult, his mother would write years later. Except the cult was run by the government and there was no escape from it. Balder's genius lay in his intuitive understanding of child psychology. He knew that children desperately crave 3 things above all others: belonging to something important, adventure and excitement, the approval of authority, figures they respect. So he gave them all 3, wrapped in Nazi ideology and presented as noble service to the fatherland. The Hitler Youth offered elaborate uniforms that made children feel significant and important. Exciting activities like marching drills, camping expeditions, and weapons training. A clear hierarchy where loyalty and enthusiasm were rewarded with promotion and increased responsibility. Most cunningly, it offered children a chance to rebel against their parents while feeling virtuous about that rebellion. They weren't being disrespectful or disobedient. They were serving a higher cause that their parents were too old or corrupted to understand. Weekly meetings were carefully structured to reinforce group identity while gradually normalizing violence and hatred. Children would gather in uniform, salute Nazi flags, and recite oaths of loyalty to Hitler that they had memorized without fully comprehending. Then they would participate in activities designed to desensitize them to human suffering. Physical training was presented as preparation for military service. Map reading exercises focused on potential invasion routes into Germany. First aid instruction emphasized battlefield medicine rather than civilian emergencies. Even traditional children's games were militarized beyond recognition. Capture the flag became simulated combat operations. Hide and seek transformed into reconnaissance training. Every innocent childhood activity was twisted into preparation for war. For girls, the indoctrination followed different pathways, but achieved identical results. The League of German Maidens taught domestic skills, but always within the context of supporting future military campaigns. Cooking lessons focused on nutrition for soldiers. Sewing projects involved making uniforms and equipment. Childcare instruction was presented as preparation for producing the next generation of warriors for the Reich. But the most intensive psychological manipulation occurred during summer camping programs. Away from parental supervision, surrounded by peers who had already been converted, children were subjected to weeks of concentrated propaganda disguised as entertainment and education. Around evening campfires, youth leaders would tell carefully crafted stories about German heroes who had died fighting foreign enemies. They would teach songs about blood and soil and racial purity that children found thrilling and mysterious. They would organize games where participants took turns playing Jewish caricatures who were hunted by brave German patriots. It was systematic dehumanization presented as innocent fun. Greta Muller was 14 when she attended her first Hitler Youth Summer Camp in 1936. She looked forward to 2 weeks in the Bavarian mountains with her friends, swimming, hiking, staying up late, telling stories. What she experienced instead was psychological warfare disguised as recreation. On the first night, the camp leader gathered all the girls around a massive bonfire and told them a story about a German village that had been corrupted by Jewish influence. How Jewish families had grown wealthy while honest Germans suffered. How Jewish children were taught to hate and exploit their German neighbors. How brave German patriots had finally expelled these parasites and restored purity to their community. Then the leader asked the girls to imagine what it would feel like to cleanse their own communities of such corruption, to protect their families and their race from contamination, to be heroes in the great struggle for German survival. The girls, caught up in the emotion and drama of the moment, enthusiastically declared they would do whatever was necessary to defend their people. Greta later described this as the moment she stopped being herself and became part of something larger and more terrible. I felt like I was joining a sacred mission, she wrote decades later. I didn't understand that the mission was pure evil. By 1939, Baldur von Schirach controlled the minds of 7.7 million German children. Every boy and girl between the ages of 10 and 18 was legally required to join the Hitler Youth. Parents who attempted to protect their children were labeled enemies of the state and faced imprisonment, or worse. The psychological results exceeded even Heinrich Himmler's most optimistic projections. When war finally came, the SS had access to an unlimited supply of young recruits who had been psychologically prepared for fanaticism from childhood. Boys who had spent years learning that violence was noble, that obedience was sacred, that certain groups of people weren't truly human. Hans Weber, that 12-year-old former Boy Scout, volunteered for the Waffen-SS on his 18th birthday in 1940. He would serve with the Hitler Youth Division in Normandy, where Canadian soldiers would kill him just 3 days after the Allied invasion began. His final letter home praised Hitler and expressed only regret that he hadn't been able to kill more enemies of the Reich before dying. His parents never got their real son back. The boy they had raised was gone, replaced by something that looked identical, but possessed a completely different soul. Greta Muller became a concentration camp guard at Ravensbrück, where she would personally supervise the execution of thousands of women and children. After the war, she claimed she had only been following orders and had never understood what she was really doing. She may have been telling the truth. The indoctrination had been that thorough and that effective. This was Heinrich Himmler's greatest victory and most horrific crime. He hadn't simply recruited soldiers for his organization. He had systematically stolen the souls of an entire generation. He had taken children who should have grown up to become doctors, teachers, productive citizens, and loving parents, and transformed them into instruments of genocide. By 1939, Heinrich owned 7.7 million young minds that had been methodically emptied of compassion, critical thinking, and moral restraint. minds that were prepared to follow any order, commit any crime, and die for any cause their leaders demanded. The perfect raw material for his expanding international army of fanatics. But even this massive recruitment success couldn't provide enough soldiers for the wars Heinrich was planning. Germany's population was limited, and many potential recruits were needed for industrial production and other essential functions. If Heinrich wanted to build a truly massive military force, capable of conquering and occupying vast territories, he would need to look beyond German borders. He would need to convince foreigners to fight and die for German dreams. The first test of his newly trained killers would come sooner than anyone expected. In September 1939, German forces crossed into Poland, beginning the war that would consume Europe and eventually the entire world. And Heinrich's SS would finally have the opportunity to prove their worth in actual combat. September 1st, 1939, a small Polish town that most people couldn't find on a map is about to become the testing ground for Heinrich Himmler's perfectly trained killers. What happens next will reveal the true nature of what the SS had become. Lieutenant Klaus Weber commanded a platoon in the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler as German forces rolled across the Polish border. 22 years old, physically perfect, academically flawless, he had survived Felix Steiner's brutal training program, endured the tank exercises, mastered the psychological conditioning. Klaus represented everything Heinrich Himmler had envisioned when he began building his elite organization. The invasion was supposed to be a clean military operation. Professional soldiers fighting professional soldiers. Defeat the Polish army, occupy strategic territory, establish German control according to the established rules of warfare. Klaus expected to engage enemy forces, capture important objectives, maybe earn some decorations for exceptional service. He had absolutely no idea he was about to become a mass murderer. The town of Bydgoszcz was unremarkable in every way. Maybe 8,000 residents, mostly farmers and small business owners, living quiet lives far from the centers of European power. The Polish army had already withdrawn, leaving behind scattered weapons and a population of terrified civilians who had no idea what German occupation would mean for their daily existence. Klaus received his initial orders on September 7th. They seemed routine enough. Secure the town, establish administrative control, await further instructions from higher command. Standard occupation procedures that any military professional would recognize and understand. But then came the second set of orders that would haunt Klaus for the remainder of his brief life. All Jewish males between 16 and 60 were to be assembled for questioning regarding suspected partisan activities. The order came directly from Heinrich Himmler's headquarters in Berlin, transmitted through proper military channels with official authorization codes. Klaus read the message 3 times, trying to make sense of instructions that seemed to contradict everything he understood about military law and civilized warfare. There were no partisans operating in Bydgoszcz. The town had surrendered without resistance of any kind. But orders were orders, and Klaus had been trained to follow them without question or hesitation. His men went house to house, pulling Jewish men from their families. Fathers, sons, grandfathers. Some were respected community leaders. The town doctor, a successful merchant. A school teacher who had educated local children for decades. Others were simple laborers who had never harmed anyone in their entire lives. All of them were absolutely terrified. They assembled 53 men in the town square. Klaus stood before them in his pristine SS uniform, looking exactly like the perfect German officer Heinrich Himmler had envisioned. But inside, something was beginning to fracture. These weren't enemy soldiers or dangerous criminals. They were ordinary civilians, confused and frightened people who had no understanding of why they were being arrested. That's when Klaus received his third and final order. Transport the prisoners to the synagogue for intensive interrogation. Klaus marched the 53 men to the small wooden synagogue on the edge of town. It was a modest building designed for maybe 100 worshippers during religious holidays. Cramming 53 prisoners inside left barely enough room for anyone to breathe properly. Klaus posted guards at every entrance and settled down to wait for the interrogation specialists to arrive. But no interrogation team appeared. Instead, at 4 o'clock that afternoon, Klaus received a radio message that would destroy his soul completely. The Jewish conspirators have been found guilty of partisan activities. Sentenced to be carried out immediately. No survivors. Klaus stared at the transmission for a full minute, reading the words over and over, hoping he had somehow misunderstood their meaning. This couldn't be real. There had been no trial, no presentation of evidence, no investigation of any kind. These men were guilty of nothing except being Jewish in German-occupied Poland. But the order was absolutely clear, transmitted through official channels with proper authorization from the highest levels of SS command. Klaus gathered his men and explained the situation with clinical detachment. Some soldiers looked shocked by what they were being asked to do. Others seemed excited by the prospect of action. Sergeant Muller asked if they were really going to execute civilians who had committed no crimes. Klaus gave the only answer his training had prepared him to give. They were following orders from the Reich. Orders that could not be questioned or disobeyed under any circumstances. They surrounded the synagogue with machine guns. Klaus could hear the prisoners inside, praying in Hebrew, crying, calling out to God for salvation that would never come. Some were probably praying for their families, others for their own souls. A few might have been praying for their captors, hoping that human decency would somehow prevail over official orders. Klaus was praying too, praying that someone with higher authority would countermand the execution order, that a rational voice would intervene before it was too late, that he wouldn't have to do what he was being commanded to do. But no salvation arrived for anyone. At 4:30, Klaus gave the order to open fire. The machine guns roared for perhaps 30 seconds. When the shooting stopped, the synagogue fell completely silent. 53 men were dead, their blood soaking into the wooden floor where generations of their ancestors had gathered to worship and celebrate life. Klaus later wrote in his diary about what happened inside his mind during those crucial moments. He expected to feel something profound: guilt, horror, shame, revulsion. Some kind of human response to what he had just done. Instead, he felt absolutely nothing at all. It was as if his soul had simply shut down to protect itself from unbearable trauma. He looked at the bodies and experienced no more emotion than if they had been sacks of grain or broken furniture. But Klaus wasn't the only SS officer who received such orders that day. Across occupied Poland, identical scenes were playing out with mechanical precision. SS units were systematically rounding up Jewish civilians, accusing them of non-existent crimes, and executing them en masse. It was coordinated, deliberate, and absolutely intentional. Most officers followed their orders without question, just as their training had conditioned them to do. But not all of them proved equally compliant. Lieutenant Wilhelm Hosenfeld was serving with an SS police battalion near Warsaw when he received similar instructions. Like Klaus, he was young, well-trained, and fanatically loyal to the Reich. Unlike Klaus, he refused to carry out mass executions of innocent people. Wilhelm read his orders carefully, then reported to his commanding officer that he could find no evidence of partisan activity among the detained civilians. He formally requested permission to release the prisoners and focus on legitimate military objectives. His commander was furious. These weren't prisoners, he explained. They were enemies of the Reich. Wilhelm would carry out his orders immediately, without further discussion or delay. Wilhelm stood at attention and delivered a response that would define his character for history. He had joined the SS to serve Germany, not to murder innocent civilians. He formally requested to be relieved of this particular duty. The court-martial was held 3 days later. Wilhelm was charged with disobeying direct orders, undermining military discipline, and showing mercy to enemies of the state. The prosecution demanded the death penalty as an example to other potentially wavering officers. Wilhelm's a soldier, not an executioner. The defense was elegantly simple. He was Ensing. The presiding judge, an older verdict, was guilty on all charges. But something unexpected happened during Cent SS officer who had served in the First World War, commuted the death sentence to 10 years in military prison. His written justification cited youthful idealism and misguided moral scruples as mitigating factors. Wilhelm spent the entire war in prison, while his former comrades committed genocide across Eastern Europe. He was one of perhaps a dozen SS officers who refused to participate in mass murder out of hundreds of thousands who followed orders without hesitation. Klaus Weber, meanwhile, continued his service with distinction and efficiency. He was promoted twice, awarded the Iron Cross, and eventually commanded an entire company in the Das Reich division. He participated in dozens of similar massacres across Poland and later in the Soviet Union. His superiors consistently praised his dedication and tactical competence. After the war, Klaus was captured by Allied forces and charged with war crimes. His defense attorney argued that he had simply been following orders, that he'd had no choice in the matter, that he was essentially a victim of the system that had created him. Klaus himself seemed to genuinely believe this narrative. In his final diary entry, written the night before his execution, he insisted that he had never wanted to hurt anyone. He had only wanted to serve his country to the best of his ability. But the truth was more complex and infinitely more damning than Klaus could admit to himself. He had possessed choices that he refused to acknowledge. Wilhelm Hosenfeld had proven that conclusively. The difference between the two men wasn't circumstance or training or the orders they received. The difference was character. And Heinrich Himmler's system had successfully destroyed the character of nearly everyone who passed through it. The massacre at Bydgoszcz was just the beginning of something far larger and more systematic. Poland became the laboratory where the SS learned they could commit any atrocity without facing meaningful consequences, where they discovered that their psychological training had worked exactly as intended, where they realized there could be no return to normal human behavior after crossing certain moral boundaries. Because once you've murdered 53 innocent people and felt nothing, you've become something that isn't quite human anymore. You've transformed into exactly what Heinrich Himmler wanted you to become. There was no going back after Poland. The SS had discovered the taste of blood, and they found it intoxicating. But Poland was merely the dress rehearsal for what would follow. In less than a year, Heinrich's perfectly trained killers would be unleashed against Western Europe, where they would encounter professional armies and established military traditions, where they would face soldiers who understood the rules of warfare and expected those rules to be honored. The SS was about to learn that different enemies required different approaches, and that lesson would be written in British blood on French soil. May 27, 1940. The German blitzkrieg has shattered French resistance and is driving British forces toward the sea in a desperate retreat that will become known as the Miracle of Dunkirk. Near the village of Le Paradis, a small group of British soldiers from the Royal Norfolk Regiment have taken refuge in a farmhouse, surrounded and outnumbered, but still fighting with characteristic stubbornness. Leading the attack against them is SS Obersturmführer Fritz Knöchlein, 35 years old, former mathematics teacher, devoted family man with 2 young children waiting for him back in Bavaria. Before the war, Fritz had spent his days helping teenagers understand algebra, attending parent-teacher conferences, grading homework assignments with meticulous care. Now he was commanding the 3rd Company of the SS Totenkopf Division, and he was about to commit mass murder against prisoners of war. How does a mathematics teacher transform into a killer? The answer lies in Fritz's journey through Heinrich Himmler's carefully constructed system of psychological manipulation and moral destruction. Fritz had joined the Nazi Party in 1932, not because of deep political conviction, but from simple career necessity. Teachers who weren't party members found themselves unemployed as the regime consolidated its control over German education. When Himmler began recruiting for SS expansion, Fritz saw an opportunity for professional advancement that his modest teaching salary could never provide. The SS offered better pay, social prestige, and the chance to be part of something historically important. Fritz attended the SS officer school at Bad Tölz, where he underwent Felix Steiner's complete training program. The tank exercises, the live ammunition drills, the systematic psychological conditioning designed to eliminate normal human responses to violence and death. When Fritz emerged 6 months later, he was no longer a mathematics teacher. He was a weapon in human form, calibrated for maximum efficiency. His first assignment was at Dachau concentration camp, where he served under the direct supervision of Theodor Eicke, the man who had personally murdered Ernst Röhm during the Night of the Long Knives. Eicke had since been placed in charge of Germany's expanding camp system, and he took special interest in promising young officers like Fritz. The key lesson Eicke taught him was elegantly simple. Stop seeing them as human beings. They weren't people with families, dreams, fears, and hopes. They were problems to be solved, obstacles to be removed, functions to be eliminated. Fritz absorbed this instruction completely and applied it with mathematical precision. When the war began, Fritz's unit was transferred from camp duties to frontline combat operations. They fought in Poland, where Fritz participated in several civilian massacres with the same methodical approach he had once used to solve equations. Then came the Western Campaign, where Fritz expected to face professional soldiers in conventional warfare, governed by established international laws. He was actually looking forward to legitimate military action. Real combat seemed somehow cleaner than murdering helpless prisoners in concentration camps, but the British soldiers defending the farmhouse at Le Paradis refused to make things easy for Fritz and his men. They had fought stubbornly all day, inflicting significant casualties on the attacking SS forces and seriously disrupting the German advance schedule. Fritz was frustrated, angry, and behind his assigned timeline. When his forces finally overran the British position, Fritz was in no mood for mercy or adherence to international law. The British soldiers emerged with their hands raised in surrender. 97 men, many wounded, all exhausted from hours of desperate fighting. They had conducted themselves with honor according to every military tradition, and they deserved treatment as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. Instead, Fritz ordered them marched to a nearby barn where he had something very different in mind. Private Albert Pooley was among the captured soldiers. 21 years old, from Norfolk, he had been wounded in the leg during the final assault, but was still able to walk. As the Germans herded their prisoners toward the barn, Albert noticed something that made his blood run cold. 2 machine guns were being positioned to face the barn wall where the prisoners would be standing. And so we reach the end of this dark journey through one of history's most complex military organizations. From Heinrich Himmler's muddy chicken farm to the burning ruins of Berlin, we've witnessed how ordinary men became instruments of extraordinary evil. The Waffen-SS was never just a military force. It was the manifestation of humanity's most dangerous impulse, the willingness to trade conscience for belonging. 1 million men from 15 nations, seduced by promises of purpose, manipulated by masters of psychological warfare, transformed into something their mothers wouldn't recognize. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, remember this sobering truth. They weren't born monsters, they were made. And that transformation remains terrifyingly possible wherever desperate people seek meaning in a chaotic world. The methods change, but the vulnerability remains constant. Sweet dreams.